Hello everyone, my name is Karis Tone. For my presentation, I want to discuss a deeply impactful intersection in psychological research, the phenomenon of late-stage ADHD diagnosis and its relationship with internalized stigma. When an individual navigates childhood and adolescence with an unrecognized neurodevelopmental condition, they do not live in a vacuum, but instead they actively seek to construct meaning from their chronic struggles with executive functioning. The discussion I've made focuses on how delayed clinical recognition, compounding cultural barriers, and systematic stigma combines to fundamentally alter individuals' identity. We will look at a specific case study, examine current literature, and review an empirical proposal designed to measure these precise dynamics. To ground this research, let us look at a case study focusing on subject S. S is a 22-year-old Filipino-Japanese man. He received his formal ADHD diagnosis in late adolescence, specifically as he was transitioning out of high school and preparing to enter higher education. This specific timing is critical. For 18 years, S navigated rigid academic and social structures without a clinical framework or vocabulary to explain his cognitive experiences. When the diagnosis finally arrived, it brought immense relief. S noted, "The struggle I went through my whole early life all made sense once the diagnosis was established and I learned how ADHD truly affects me." For S, proper clinical diagnosis and treatment unlocked a profound sense of validation. The hidden friction he had experienced for years was finally externalized. It wasn't a personal failure, but it was a neurobiological reality. However, the relief of a late diagnosis does not instantly erase years of psychological conditioning. This brings us to our primary area of concern, self-stigma and identity fragmentation. When a child lives undiagnosed, their executive failures, such as forgetting assignments, chronic lateness, or emotional dysregulation, are routinely observed by the public. Without a medical explanation, society defaults to moral judgments. The child is repeatedly labeled as lazy, careless, or unmotivated. Over time, a severe psychological battle occurs. The child internalizes these negative public labels. They begin to believe they are fundamentally broken or lazy. This manifests as a chronic state of personal self-stigma and severely compromised self-esteem. By the time they reach adulthood, their identity is deeply fragmented, split between who they are and the negative constructs they have been forced to accept. For us, this internalization was heavy, compounded by what we call the collectivist factor. Within Filipino and Japanese family dynamics, interdependence, harmony, and adherence to social expectations are deeply valued. In these cultural contexts, behavioral variances or executive failures are frequently viewed not as medical issues, but as individual shortcomings or points of shame. There is immense pressure to conform and perform. These cultural dynamics directly delay clinical intervention. Because S exhibited a more subtle, inattentive type presentation rather than overt hyperactivity, his struggles were rarely flagged by primary educators, and he was able to slip through the cracks, hidden behind the masking he developed. To understand how S's experience reflects broader trends, let's turn to recent psychiatric and social science research examining public stigma, cognitive masking, and quality of life in late diagnosed adults. First, a 2025 study titled Perceptions of Stigma and Social Inclusion Amongst University Students with ADHD evaluated how public attitudes transform directly into internal self-stigma within academic environments. The research found that being consistently labeled lazy throughout youth leads individuals to permanently trivialize their own neurodevelopmental struggles, even after they receive clinical confirmation. This aligns perfectly with the social model of disability. It demonstrates that it is often the hostile attitude and barriers and societal misunderstandings rather than the condition itself that construct psychological trauma and create permanent internal sense of defeat. This brings us to our major theme found in 2026 test, the late diagnosed mind, ADHD and autism in adults. This research highlights that undiagnosed individuals exhaust massive cognitive resources to mask or camouflage their executive dysfunction during childhood just to fit into systems. We can look at this through two distinct lenses. The medical model acknowledges the core neurological vulnerabilities and innate executive variances that these individuals possess. The social model, however, identifies that a crisis or transition collapse is triggered when society demands unassisted, typical performance without providing structural support. When a student transitions to higher education, the scaffolding of high school disappears. The cognitive energy required to mask becomes unsustainable, leading to severe burnout and sudden or academic psychological collapse. The consequences of this prolonged stigma are quantified in a 2026 systematic review focusing on quality of life. The researchers identified two major areas of concern: behavioral independencies and structural. The consequences of this prolonged stigma are quantified in a 2026 systematic review focusing on quality of life. The researchers identified two major areas of concern: behavioral impediments and structural inequalities. Behaviorally, adult self-stigmas act as a direct barrier to care. Individuals who have internalized shame actively avoid help-seeking behaviors, resist medication adherence, and avoid workplace clinical disclosure due to an intense, deeply rooted fear of rejection. They would rather suffer in silence than face a secondary layer of public labeling. Structurally, in collectivist contexts, deviations from rigid social norms face deep-seated systematic public prejudice, intensifying isolation. Structural stigma and rigid institutional policies combine to create real, measurable economic, professional, and wellness barriers for neurodivergent populations. In response to these findings, I am proposing an empirical research designed to systematically analyze the relationships between diagnosis, age, cultural demographics, and long-term internalized self-stigma. This will be a cross-sectional correlational study. This design allows for us to ethically track natural, unmanipulated relationships between our variables without intrusive intervention. To quantify this, we will utilize a modified 29-item internalized stigma of mental illness, or ISMI scale. This scale is highly effective because it breaks down quantity's 5 distinct domains of internalized stigma: alienation, stereotype endorsement, perceived discrimination, social withdrawal, and stigma resistance. Our sample architecture targets 100 participants structured to ensure at least 25 participants per demographic and clinical subgroup. This will give us the statistical power needed to validate group comparisons between early versus late diagnosis and bioculture versus monoculture backgrounds. While the qualitative data will provide statistical architecture, we must also capture the lived, nuanced realities of these individuals. Therefore, the study incorporates 3 core qualitative respective measures. Question 1 focuses on retrospective self-narratives, asking participants to describe the internal explanations or stories they constructed to make sense of their difficulties before they had access to a formal diagnosis. Question 2 evaluates cultural interpretation factors, examining the specific ways cultural expectations or family values shaped how early executive difficulties were interpreted by others. Question 3 tracks post-diagnostic identity integration, investigating how their relationships with their own identity altered during the first 12 months following their formal diagnosis, specifically regarding their view of how their own intelligence and capabilities. Based on our literature review and case study of Subject S, we have established 2 primary hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 states that participants diagnosed late, aged 18 or older, will display significantly higher baseline scores on the ISMI, alienation, and stereotype endorsement subscales compared to childhood diagnosed individuals. The logic here is that the prolonged absence of a clinical framework leaves youth highly vulnerable to personalized systemic deficit labels. Hypothesis 2 looks at intersectionality, and I hypothesize that bioculture or racial minority participants within the late diagnosis cohort will demonstrate the highest overall levels of social withdrawal and lowest of stigma resistance. This highlights the compounding pressure of navigating collectivist culture expectation alongside unrecognized and visible executive functions. The goal of this research is to inform systematic and clinical interventions that dismantle these barriers. I propose that in 3 areas. First, we must champion universal design. Higher education and workplace environments need to transition away from rigid, hyper-medicalized models. By standardizing default, transparent task breakdowns, and offering diverse visual project delivery options, we make environments accessible to everyone without requiring vulnerable self-disclosure. Second, we need asset-based frameworks. We must reconceptualize the executive variance as neutral biological diversities rather than purely behavioral or cognitive deficits. Shifting this is crucial to short-circuiting the internal familial shame dynamics. Finally, we must develop tailored minority programs. We need community-based mental health initiatives specifically designed for collectivist and bioculture populations. Framing neurodevelopmental conditions through culturally sensitive bilingual education. By addressing these systematic cultural and individual layers, we can ensure that late diagnosis individuals no longer have to break themselves to fit into rigid systems. Instead, we can build a culture of understanding that protects their identity and psychological well-being. Thank you so much for your time.